I'm Nancy Beardsley. I'm the acting director for Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention.
I'm Jenny Tilton Flood. I'm a dairy farmer in Clinton, Maine, and I'm representing a seat of agriculture.
And we have some committee members online. Senator Brenner.
Thank you so much. Stacey Brenner. I represent Senate District 30, which includes all of Gorham and most of Scarborough.
Adrian. You're muted.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Adrian Lee. I am a farmer in Knox, Maine. I represent agriculture on the committee.
Thank you. Becca.
Good afternoon, Becca Bowles, Executive Director at Maine Public Health Association, and I have the public health position, one of the public health positions on the committee.
Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot. Could you introduce yourself?
Hey, everybody. Nancy McBrady, Deputy Commissioner, Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, here on behalf of the Commissioner in Manfield.
Thank you. Are there any other committee members online? All right. With that, I am, well, Senator Brenner, did you want to make any welcoming remarks, or I can just start with an overview?
Well, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you.
I think we had a poor connection. We caught just a little bit of that, but I will, I'll go ahead and share my screen. And just to give, oops, there. So remote people, are you seeing PFAS Fund Advisory Committee meeting slide? Okay, thanks. So I want to give a quick overview of recent activity, and then we will move into discussion of the PFAS Fund implementation plan. This is the fourth version of the plan. The first version was reviewed by the advisory committee on May 1, and that was really 3/4 of the plan. It was the recommendations for financial and business support, for land acquisition and management and research. We came together the following week to review the recommendations for the health strategies. So that was version 2 of the plan. Based on the feedback received from those 2 meetings, I revised the plan version 3 that went out for public comment. We had a public hearing on June 12th, and then kept the comment period open for another week until June 19th. Following that public input period, revised the plan again to bring us to this, the 4th version. And the purpose of today's meeting is to get the advisory committee's approval on this plan, hopefully. Sort of in the mix here, in the middle of May, I provided an update to the Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry Committee at the legislature. That resulted in some statutory changes, not really to the scope of the program, but related to per diem for the public members, related to the tenure of the legislators on the committee, and some reporting requirements. The most significant changes since the version that went out for public comment is a reduction to the budget. As you all know, the initial projected budget was $80 million. We have been allocated $60 million. So we needed to trim that budget. You will notice, of course, that we have not trimmed it all the way back to $60 million, and I will explain that shortly. Oops, let me let somebody in. So the trimming came from income replacement, infrastructure, and land acquisition and maintenance. These shifts were based on the Bureau of Agriculture, Food and Rural Resources experience to date, working, managing income replacement and infrastructure payments. They're also based on DEP's progress to date, working through their groundwater and soil testing. They've just about completed tiers 1 and 2, which are the categories most likely to have highly contaminated farm properties. They're moving into tier 3, which has the largest number of properties. We anticipate that more farms will be identified, but we hope that the most highly impacted farms have been identified. Another change to the budget, operational costs, something that we described in strategy 1D. It's very similar to the Bureau's existing farm viability program. So we recommended shifting what we were calling operational costs, incorporating that into the existing farm viability program. So even though that's no longer part of this implementation plan, the work will still be done. There's still funding available through the bureaus. So even though it's not in the budget, the work will be done. That support is available. Additionally, in addition to the cuts, we think it is reasonable to anticipate federal funding over the next 5 years. There's a lot of interest at USDA, EPA, USGS in research and other aspects of providing support to the agricultural community related to PFAS. So even though our projected budget still exceeds what we presently have allocated, I'm fairly confident that we will be able to meet all of the projected needs. And with that, the program will continually be reevaluated as we have more experience with what sort of, which of these different strategies are most popular, how many people take advantage of them, what their specific requests are. We can rebalance the budget as we go along, and that will be done at least annually and probably more often than that. So with that, that's an overview of how we got to be here today. I stop sharing. So what I would like to ask the advisory committee today is to just sort of walk through the plan. There are 23 separate strategies I've identified with track changes, where changes have been made from the previous version. I would like for each strategy, ask the committee to recommend any changes. If so, what are those specific changes? Alternatively, if you're happy with the strategy as written, can we accept it as drafted and just go through each of the 23 strategies that way? So with that, let's start with income replacement, strategy 1A. This would provide income replacement to impacted farmers for up to 2 years, adjusted for inflation. As farms return to viability and start earning income, or maybe they never had to cease operations entirely, the income that they are earning will offset their income replacement payments. As the name suggests, it is income replacement, not augmentation. And as I noted, this is one area where we did cut the budget by $2 million. So advisory committee members who are online, if you have comments, please raise your hand, turn the camera on.
Beth, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So after the trimming was done, did the subcommittee come back and look at the revised plan?
Well, the revision, the trimming was done with the subcommittees.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So I got one question I have. I know in the research subcommittee, the idea for the RFP will be developed by DACF. It's the same case, for example, A committee of DACF and outside reviewers will assess the application. Those rules will be developed.
Right,
Okay.
right. So the department, this is Anthony Irwin, he's a law student working with me this summer. We have already begun drafting rules. There are different 11 elements of this plan where the department needs to determine whether an applicant meets criteria. So we need to develop rules for those. So we've begun drafting those. We've begun drafting policies that we will share with Department of Administrative and Financial Services for their approval. We're working on an application. The idea is that there'll be a single application for all of the direct financial support to farmers, so that sort of a one-stop shop, kind of tick through which of the different offerings an individual farmer is interested in. So all of those things are sort of in the works. Once the plan is finalized, we'll share, the internal policy sort of more widely within government. The rulemaking will be a public process. There'll be notice, there'll be a hearing. The rulemaking process is roughly a 3-month process, so it'll be, well into the fall before the rules for the research grants for income replacement, et cetera, are in place.
Clear to me. I don't have any other comments.
Okay. So maybe it's better to ask, does anybody have any objections to the income replacement as written? And in this room, I'm not seeing any on the screen. I will indicate unanimous support for income replacement. Moving on to roster of experts. This would provide no-cost technical assistance to farmers for things like business planning, public relations, agricultural production specialists to help navigate the transition from their existing form of production to a new form of production. So again, any objections to roster of experts as written? None? Online? That is also unanimous. One C are the PFAS response navigators. This is different from the roster of experts. That would be 1B was the no-cost assistance to write the business plan, for example. The navigator would be the person to help connect the impacted farmer to the business planner, help identify which programs the impacted farmer is eligible to apply for, maybe help with the homework, with the record keeping, help connect to blood testing, to help connect with the researcher who may be interested in conducting research on that property. So this is really a facilitator type position. The one change since the initial draft of the plan is we've added the potential for hiring this person through an organization called Medical Care Development. That's an organization of community health workers who's really has sort of like a social worker background, and their job is, like I just described, making connections, helping to facilitate connection to services. So that certainly seems like an avenue to explore. The other alternatives as written in the plan are to hire this position through the department or to work with the nonprofit ag community. Any objections to PFAS response navigators? In the room?
This is Becca. I don't have any objection. I just want to, I'm glad to see the community health worker position named here. So I think that's great.
Great, thank you. Adrian?
Yeah, I just Can I get clarity on, it's still an option for an impacted farmer to choose which route they go as far as getting a facilitator, or is it only going to be through that, or will there be like a BACF dictate what organization we're using for having a facilitator?
So right now, the plan describes these three alternative avenues. The department, MOFGA, Maine Farmland Trust, or the community health workers, without specifying. It'll be up to the department to sort out, I guess, the most bang for the buck. If we can maybe contract with multiple community health workers for the amount that it would cost to hire a full-time state employee, that may be the avenue that's chosen. The plan sort of lays out the options, but doesn't specify which will ultimately be selected.
Right, okay, so that will be the department's, at the department's discretion, that component. It's not really part of a decision that would be made here.
Yeah, I guess the question really is, is this role, this facilitator navigator role, something that should be supported by the fund? And if so, it'll be up to the department to sort out how to do that.
Okay.
So are you comfortable with that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm as comfortable as I think for what our roles are here, I am comfortable with that.
Thank you. So any other comments on the navigators? All right, so no objections online? So unanimous again for navigators. 1D is compensation for time spent on PFAS response. This one is a bit of a significant change, but then again, not really. As I mentioned in the beginning, so the previous draft of 1D was operational and response payments was the title. The operational payments were payments that would be above and beyond income replacement to help a farm maintain viability, which very much felt like what the farm viability program through the Bureau of Ag is already doing. And as I mentioned, we've started drafting rules, and I was trying to, draft the policy and the rules and distinguish operational payments from farm viability. And it was just getting all muddled in my head. So we've taken operational payments out. Those sorts of payments will still be eligible for funding through the Bureau, through the Farm Viability Program. So that leaves just farmer compensation for PFAS response in the plan. And once PFAS is identified on a farm, the farmer has to figure out, well, what comes next? And there's that, waiting time for test results and, meeting with the agricultural PFAS specialist from the department. And the recommendation from the subcommittee is that these farmers ought to be compensated for the time they spend above and beyond sort of the routine operations of their farm. We obviously need to quantify this in order to pass muster, to pass an audit. So the thinking is that these payments could be for things like time spent working with the agricultural PFAS specialists or working with other ag service providers on the strategies related to responding to PFAS. So there's a lot of red ink on this page, but really it's we've trimmed the text, but the support for farmers for both categories still remains within the department. So any comments in the room on compensation for time spent on PFAS response? Okay, online, any objections?
Just a quick question for you. I feel like we talked about it in the subcommittee, but is the rate established as well, or is that to be determined through the?
To be determined based on data from Bureau of Labor Statistics. I'm going to call that unanimous again. The next category is infrastructure strategy 1E. The only change here is a reduction in the budget of, I think about a total of 4 million overall. I'm sorry, 3 million. Initially it was 17 million, now it's 14 million for infrastructure. Again, based on the department's current experience, the number of farms the department is presently working with, the needs of those farms, and DEP's progress working through their tiered testing system. Yes, one thing I should point out, at the bottom of page 14. Everywhere where we have a review panel, I've added a sentence: review panel members who are not paid by an employer to participate should be compensated by the state for their time. So this acknowledges that oftentimes our review panel members are farmers. They're taking time away from their livelihood in order to help implement state policy, and in respect for their time, I've added an element of compensation. So, any objections in the room? And online, any objections? Let's leave pass that one as well. Excellent. Strategy 1F is loan assistance. There's an incorrect citation on the top of page 16. I've corrected that. Other than that, there were no changes from earlier drafts. There's support in the room for loan assistance. And online. And support for loan assistance 1F. Public relations and marketing. This provides assistance with crisis communication, with marketing and rebranding as farms emerge, and sort of just general anytime communication from the department. It is a relatively small budget item. Like I said, no changes from the earlier versions. Is there support in the room for PR and marketing? Thank you. And online, is there support for PR and marketing? Any objections? The PFAS response kit. This will be a physical packet of information, maybe in a binder, laying out all of the programs that are available. The Bureau has already begun assembling packets and sharing them with impacted farmers, and that just primarily information about the existing programs available through the Bureau. And that packet will sort of be the foundation of this PFAS response kit. Again, any objections in the room? And online? Okay, unanimous. The next section is land. The budget here was reduced by about $3.5 million, primarily from land purchases and management of those of properties once the department acquires them. I also removed a salaried position, a public service coordinator, from this section and moved it to the research section. With the most recent budget passed by the legislature, I will hopefully be able to hire somebody to oversee the land acquisition and management portion of the program sometime around mid-October. So I no longer need to fund that position through the PFAS fund, but we still need staff to manage other elements of the program. So I just shifted that position from land to research. So strategy 2A is land purchases. Really no significant changes here other than the removal of the public service coordinator position. Any objections to strategy 2A in the room? And online, any objections to 2A? Yes. 2B is
Sorry, Beth, I'm sorry. Is it possible on 4A, page, I think 38? Yes, 28, I'm sorry. You see what I'm looking at?
4A.
Who should be on the review panel?
Yes.
Can we rephrase and the representative of Maine's Indigenous community to a representative of the Indigenous community in Maine? So it's just not,
Oh, yes, not possessive. Yep.
thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Any other comments on? So I guess just to clarify, with that change, is there still full support for 2A? Thank you. D, DACF holds and manages land purchased by the fund. The idea here is that sort of while the sale itself is pending, the department will begin developing management plans, thinking about what we're going to do with it. Potentially some of this property could be used as an experiment station, potentially some will be leased out, maybe for agricultural purposes, maybe for solar development. If the property is suitable for solar, I think we'll have a conversation with the landowner before the sale and encourage that landowner to do the solar development rather than the state. On page 33, towards the bottom, there was a question in earlier versions of the plans, should any group have priority when land is sold? And a recommendation was added. For instance, should the prior owner or members of the prior owner's family be given the right of first refusal? So that's still sort of an open question, but that's something that the review panel for land acquisitions will be considering as they're developing policies and rules. I think that was no other really significant changes to DACF's management of property. So in the room, is there any objections to 2B? Online, any objections to 2B? Okay, unanimous. Strategy 2C is conservation payments. So this would be payments made to an impacted farmer who can no longer raise agricultural crops on that property. But in exchange for adopting some sort of conservation practices to advance either climate or wildlife management goals, the farmer would receive payment. There was a lot of public support for this recommendation. The tricky thing is that, you know, we have a finite amount of money here. We can, as proposed, enter into contracts for a 5-year period of time. Maybe by then there'll be, you know, federal or other programs available where we could enter into contracts for, or the farmer could enter into contract maybe for 20 years, which seems like a better time horizon to deal with remediation of PFAS. At the subcommittee meeting after the public hearing, an interesting point came up that taking this land out of production would make the farm ineligible for the current use tax program, which allows farmers to pay a lower rate of property tax on active farmland. So the suggestion was that we set the baseline for these payments at whatever that particular farm's property tax bill is, and then could maybe build on top of that, you know, X amount of dollars for migratory bird habitat practices, et cetera. So the specifics of, you know, what the compensation would be and what the adopted practices would be is to be developed. We don't have those answers yet. That's why I need to hire somebody to manage this portion of the program. Taking into account that use of land has tax implications both for the property owner and for the municipality where it is based. So that's something that will be grappled with as this program is developed. So are there any questions or comments?
I have no objection to this. I'm just curious whether or not the subcommittee considered or whether it's worth considering going forward as these strategies become more refined. Is there a scenario in which a farmer would request a little bit of everything, like in terms of purchasing sections of its land and other parts to receive conservation payments? Or do you think that might be feasible, or am I just getting ahead of myself here?
So conceivably it's feasible. We talked under 2A land purchases. It's written into the plan that the state will work with the farmer if the farmer wants to sell a parcel, we would entertain that. There would have to be, you know, road access. It couldn't be a landlocked parcel without access, for instance. But in theory, if a landowner wanted to sell a piece of the property, we would entertain that. And then, which leaves open the possibility under strategy 2B, or D rather, see, my alphabet's all mixed up, C, that they could conceivably implement conservation practices and receive compensation for that. But I think it would have to be on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks.
So any objections to 2C? None in the room and online? Okay. And the final element of the land section is strategy 2D, guidance on land transactions. This is a low budget, kind of a no budget item. Actually, it would be accomplished by existing staff. just providing information to appraisers and realtors, even, the general public of, what to consider when purchasing real estate impacted by PFAS. Any objections in the room? And any objections online? Moving into research, here the budget increased by about $450,000, and that is salary for 4 years for a public service coordinator to oversee and administer the competitive research grants and potentially also help to establish an experiment station. So 3A, competitive research grants. There's be 2 pots of money for multi-year projects up to $500,000 and smaller scale rapid response projects. Generally not to exceed $250,000. Other than adding the public service coordinator, there's been no changes here. Any objections in the room? Online? Unanimous? The 3B is the experiment station, as I mentioned, in relation to land purchases. One, and I say one because conceivably just the expense of running an experiment station, I don't realistically see more than one. If additional sources of funding should become available later, maybe we would consider more than one, but for the time being, we're thinking that one property could become an experiment station available for dedicated research over time. Researchers would be able to know that they could carry out multi-year experiments. So once the state begins acquiring property, we will also begin conversations with the research community about what would make a suitable location. So any objection in the room to an experiment station? And online? And 3C is compile and share scientific information. As a requirement of receiving grant funding or working on the to be established experiment station, researchers would have to agree to share data in an open exchange format. They would have to agree to share publications. Then the ACF would host this data through a portal on our website. And linking with other, academic and research organizations. Any objections to sharing information?
Oh, no, but I applaud the props to Maine State Library.
Okay. Yeah, since 1837. And online, any objections to 3D? You see, all right, alphabet problems again. Okay, moving into health. On page 51, there is a clarification that resulted from a comment received during the public comment period about who is eligible for assistance through the PFAS fund. And the language in the statute establishing the fund is very broad. It refers to persons whose drinking water or agricultural land is found to be contaminated by PFAS. Given that the fund was established in response to the discovery of PFAS on farms linked directly to the land application of biosolids, the subcommittee and the department made the determination that drinking water impacted by that same source, by land application of biosolids, is what was being referred to. And that is supported by the legislative history, by the testimony given last year to the legislature. So I just want to be clear that the fund, while the fund recognizes the need for many populations who have potentially been exposed to PFAS to have access to blood testing and medical monitoring, the PFAS fund is only paying for individuals who've been impacted through the land application of biosolids. We do highlight throughout the plan where there are other potentially impacted populations, whether through occupation, exposure to a military site, or other avenues. There are other folks out there. The intention with the blood testing medical monitoring is that once the systems are set up, they can be expanded to include other populations depending on funding and support, financial support. So with that, strategy 4A is blood testing. The intention is to make blood testing available to individuals who's have been impacted, again, land application of biosolids. So farm families, farm workers, and residential wells. And the fund will pay for the cost of blood testing above costs that are covered by insurance. Questions in the room 2A. And online? Unanimous. 4B is public health oversight. This would set up a system similar to childhood pediatric blood testing, where blood results, test results are automatically reported to Maine CDC. Similarly, PFAS blood serum test results would be reported to Maine CDC. The budget item here is for a staff toxicologist and clinical staff to work at CDC. Any objections in the room? And online, any objection? That's unanimous. Medical monitoring. For the blood test results are most likely going to identify some individuals whose blood serum level is above that of the general population. And for that subset of the individuals who are tested, eligible for blood testing through the PFAS fund, those individuals whose blood serum levels are above that of the general population will be advised to have enhanced medical monitoring, and the PFAS fund will pay for that medical monitoring that is not otherwise covered by health insurance. Any objection in the room? Any objection online? That's unanimous. The next section is medical treatment, and in this section, the subcommittee identified, so we have again, starting with our population who's eligible for blood testing. Some of those folks are going to be eligible for medical monitoring. Some of those folks are likely going to develop disease associated with PFAS exposure. Acknowledging that it's not possible to link any one incidence of disease to PFAS exposure, the subcommittee is recommending that if a condition develops, that it presumes that it be presumptively connected to PFAS exposure, and that the state explore ways to provide medical insurance, whether it's through main care or some other means, to this population. This is not funded as proposed here in this plan. It is a recommendation that the state explore ways to provide long-term care to this population. Any questions in the room? Any objections to? Online, any objections to 4D? Unanimous? For E is a PFAS body burden reduction clinical trial. The intention with this trial would be to remove PFAS from the human body. There are, excuse me, different techniques, potentially therapeutic phlebotomy, blood draws, or certain medications that cause somebody to excrete PFAS more quickly, and other techniques. So this proposal would sort of two phases. One, we would hire a consulting company to design the study and then to oversee this clinical trial. The advantage, obviously, to the participants is that those who aren't in the control group have an opportunity to reduce their body burden of PFAS. Any objection in the room to 4E clinical trial? Online? Mental health care. This is a proposal to provide mental health support, again, to that same population impacted farm families, farm workers, and residents whose well water has been contaminated by land application of biosolids. There have not been any significant changes to this section. Relative to earlier drafts. So any objections to 4F? Online, any objections to 4F? Um, 4G is educational resources. Primarily, this will be CDC's task to develop educational materials, both for clinicians as well as impacted communities. When is blood testing recommended? What do the results mean? How do you access blood testing, etc. So any objections in the room to 4G, educational materials? And online, any objections to 4G?
I have a clarifying question going back to the prior mental health or there's a note at the very end, page 79. And it states note dedicated long-term funding is needed to support a permanent mental health support program for the ag community. Is that sort of a generic statement respective of PFAS, or is it more of a, would it be the PFAS fund that is underlying a permanent mental health support program for the ag community?
So the idea is that the fund would establish a mental health support program for the ag community, but there would be need for another source to carry it forward.
I was reading it through the primary lens of the PFAS overlay of the mental health stress, you know, that is triggered by that. And more broadly, there's certainly lots of other mental health concerns relative to the broader agricultural community. So I'm just wanting to make sure that I'm understanding fully that the PFAS fund is being requested to essentially move forward with a comprehensive overarching mental health, whether or not PFAS might be the cause for somebody.
Right, so page 76, second to last paragraph.
Okay.
The initial focus will be farmers, including farm members and workers impacted through land application of biosolids. Over time, the program will be accessible to all members of Maine's agricultural community.
Okay, I guess I just wasn't understanding the sort of, we set it forward and then ultimately additional funding like necessary
Right.
beyond that. Okay, thank you.
So 4H is a soil exposure study. This was previously presented as a biomonitoring study. Is now called a farmer soil exposure study, being a little more precise in the language that this would be a study conducted by Maine CDC to look at soil as a pathway to try to identify inhalation, dermal exposure. How much is it a concern? And if so, what is the magnitude of that concern? And based on the results, CDC could provide guidance on how to minimize exposure.
Just for clarification, I noticed the change from farm worker to farmer. I just off the top of your head, the definition of farmer is a landowner? Or
Not necessarily a landowner, but the person working this.
so it would include ag workers as well?
Yes,
Okay.
the intention is certainly to include ag workers in this study.
Okay.
Want to change the title to farmer and farm worker soil exposure study?
I guess it just needs to be defined well, because I would hate hate for someone to not feel included, and I would hate for someone to interpret it as a means of exclusion.
Right, that
Also-
point, that is not the intention at all.
Also, better science if we include more people.
So if I use the term just farm worker, does that exclude anybody? Does that like?
I don't know. I'm not a lawyer.
No, but just like. The perception that the farm worker is the person out in the field and that is separate from the farmer, even though it's often one and the same person.
Maybe it should say farmer and farm worker or ag worker.
There's actually a
Adrian?
hand raised.
I guess just to add, I would encourage us to both say farmer and farm worker just to make sure that both populations are covered. I mean, interpret it that way. That'd be the only comment.
It's enough to get it. Okay, so with that clarification, any objection in the room to 4H? Okay, and online, any objection to 4H? None, that is also unanimous. That is it, folks. So I will make the minor changes we discussed today. We have adopted this plan unanimously. Thank you. Thank you to all the subcommittee members. I neglected to say at the beginning that these 4 subcommittees collectively met 25 times between January and April to develop the strategies that are the foundation of this plan. A considerable amount of time and thoughtful effort went into developing this plan. All of you in the advisory committee, you're critical, taking a look at it, asking the questions, does this make sense? Thank you. I think we have an impressive, comprehensive plan that is going to help a lot of folks through these trying times. Which brings us to next steps. As I mentioned in the beginning, Anthony and I and other folks within the department are already working on developing the policies and the rules. Once the rules are ready for prime time, there'll be public notice. We'll announce them through our website, probably press releases, so people know when those public hearings and public comments periods will be. I'm going to try to have as few public rulemaking procedures as possible, meaning like maybe try to do like 7 or 8 rules in one proceeding, all related. I'll be working with Maine CDC and developing the rules for the blood testing, medical monitoring, mental health care. For some elements, like I said, where we need, when we can work off of an internal policy, like the existing income replacement program, I'm working on revising that policy to share with DAFs. And hopefully, within a month, I think it's conceivable that the income replacement can shift to the PFAS fund. Other things are going to be longer term. Land acquisition rules need to be in place before we can close on a property, but that doesn't mean that we can't start the process of at least collecting names and information from people that are potentially interested in selling their property. Going forward, the fund will need to develop a system for sort of regular communication out to the agricultural community and through organizations that have the ear of the agricultural community, so we get information out so people know when different programs come online and how to apply for them. So again, thank you all. Well done.
Beth, I'm sorry. I tried getting my hand up and I don't think I did it fast enough. I just have a quick question. The last recommendation just made me wonder about under the experimental station section on page 47, there are safety protocol examples listed. And I'm just because of the last recommendation, I was just wondering if included in there, they did talk about human safety protocols for soil exposure? Or was it just focused on animals and plants and equipment, things like that? I'm really sorry to take you back there. That felt important to ask you.
We're on page 47.
What documentation?
Okay. My recollection of that conversation was kind of broadly, we weren't excluding anything, Diane?
So, these in my mind always have to do with human exposure. So it's almost like e.g. for handling soils, plants, animals, equipment. Those are the safety protocols that we develop and certainly would be needed for an experiment station. So I think in my mind, what we were talking about were human safety protocols for handling all of those materials.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right, any final comments?
Thank you. Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
I'm sure everybody.